Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another week of the Let's Talk Social Innovation podcast. I hope you've had an amazing start to your week, but if not, we can kickstart that right here. I'm your host, Ian Kahinde, and y'all know the deal. Got to get through this week's bulletin board. So, first and foremost, join Cole Arthur Riley, New York Times bestselling author of Black Liturgies and This Here Flesh. Cole Arthur Riley and FHC writer-in-residence Damon Young on Wednesday, March 19th at 11:30 a.m. This will be an intimate writing workshop about writing the bodies we inhabit. It will be a hands-on experience. The first 5 students of the event will receive a free copy of Black Liturgies. Register at the link in the description. Next up, FHC's writer-in-residence Damon Young is bringing Cole Arthur Riley to campus for a special conversation on Wednesday, March 19th at 6 p.m. at Heinz Chapel. Cole Arthur Riley is a Pitt alum and New York Times best-selling author of Black Liturgies and This Here Flesh. Claim your spot at the link in the bio. The first 15 FHC students at the event will receive a free copy of Black Liturgies. Next up, join the Community and Governmental Relations Committee on the Student Government Board on March 19th at 7 p.m. in Nordy's Place for their annual Women in Politics panel. The goal of this panel is to celebrate Women's History Month and promote civic engagement on Pitt's campus. No registration needed. The panelists are Dr. Chris Kempthak, Morgan Overton, Kip Dawson, and Olivia Pinocchio, Washington. Next up, the Office of the Provost invites you to share your vision for general education reform at our upcoming student engagement event, Aspire and Inspire. Chart the future of student learning at Pitt. This event will take place in the University Club Ballroom from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. on Monday, March 24th. Dinner will be served, and we'll be raffling off Panther Pride baskets. Students can receive OCC credit for participating. RSVP at the link in the bio. Lastly, the leap from social media posts and chats with friends to effective social action feels like it's ever growing. Join Dr. Daniel Mikix on March 25th at 6 p.m. in the Cathedral of Learning 2017 as we explore how we can find meaningful steps towards social engagement and change. Dr. Mikix is a current Fulbright Scholar at Pitt and a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Political Science and the HUNREN Center for Social Sciences in Budapest. He's also a guest lecturer at the Eötvös Loránd University Budapest. His research interests include social movements, civil society, and political participation. That is definitely not something you want to miss. Now, just about now, you should be seeing something on your screen with everything that we talked about in the bulletin board if you'd like to register or attend. But anyways, y'all, everything else aside, the reason we are here is the incredible Dr. Leah Fabiano. How are we feeling today?
Oh, I'm feeling great. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so happy that you're here. When Mary brought you to my attention, I knew that this was an episode that we had to have.
Thank you for the invitation. This is great.
Now, as always, we'll be going through Dr. Fabiano's backstory, the things that made her the person that she is today. We'll be touching on the best life advice that she can pass on. Then, as always, we'll have our artist spotlight. In the second half, we'll be talking about the advancement of minorities in academia. But anyways, take me from the beginning, Dr. Fabiano.
Well, I was born and raised in Buffalo, New York. So for those of you who know where Buffalo is, it's on the border of the U.S. and Canada in Western New York.
Very cold.
Very cold for the vast majority of the year. And I hate the cold. You'd think growing up in Buffalo, you'd get used to it. I don't ski. I don't ice skate. I don't do any of that stuff. Mm-hmm. I really enjoy being on the beach, so I don't know how that happened. But I was born in Buffalo, and for those who kind of know the ethnic and racial fabric of that area of the country, if you are white there, you are either Irish, Italian, or Polish, one of those ethnicities. And I am of the Italian and Irish varieties, and I grew up with immigrant backgrounds. And the immigrant stories in both sides of my family are stories of poverty, of transgenerational trauma. My families left their countries of origin because of colonization, because of starvation, not for good reasons, right? They were really forced out of their countries of origin. And I think that that trauma gets passed down generations and it gets expressed in different ways. And it certainly landed in my generation in different ways. And so growing up in an immigrant family, especially on the Italian side of my immigrant family, I experienced as the oldest daughter, a lot of sexism growing up, and there were different expectations for girls in terms of careers and where they were going. When I was kind of exploring college and what I was going to do with my life, my father said, well, why don't you think about becoming a speech language pathologist? It'll be a good career for a mother because you'll have a chance to be with your children as well as working. And my brothers didn't have that talk with my father. They were encouraged to be doctors and be professors and, anything they wanted to be. And, but here I am as a professor regardless. So I ended up, in a very demanding job. I also have 3 children, so it all worked out regardless. You can do both. But I think really growing up and going against the grain and having a personality that didn't fit with what the expectations were of the world I grew up in set me up to have a sort of understanding of students who find themselves in a world where the expectations of them are low, but they know they have capabilities that are bigger than that. So I've always had that inner feeling of there's injustice, right? And I'm going to right the injustice. And I really think that comes from me. It comes from my own experiences of feeling like I've been underestimated.
So let me ask you this. When your father recommended becoming a speech language pathologist because it could be easier to be a homemaker, do you think it came from a place of love or a place of perpetuating machismo?
I think it came from a place of love and really not knowing any better, and really just sharing with me what he knew and his understanding of how the world worked. And so I know that now as a grown adult. I know that. I understand that he could only meet me as far as he could meet himself and understand the world around him. But it also gives me a window into the culture I grew up in, and that there was certainly a hierarchy. For example, when I would go to my Italian grandparents' house, we would have this all-day dinner, and the girls had to go into the kitchen and wash the dishes while the boys sat around and watched football. And I'd say, why did they get to sit and watch football? Because that didn't happen in my home with my parents. My brothers had chores too. But in my grandmother's house, the boys got to sit and watch football, and the girls had to go do dishes. And I was outraged by this. And my father would say, just go help your grandmother. Like, shh, quiet down. Just go help your grandmother.
Being a little complicit.
Yeah, just kind of trying to say, go along. And I think that I've started to realize, oh, my role in this world is different. And I am going to be treated differently. And I'm walking a different path than my brothers are walking. And so I think that really shaped a lot of what I ended up doing. And so when I went to college, I pursued speech language pathology. I listened to my dad because, when you're 18 years old and you don't really know what you want to do, you just listen to your parents and you go along with things.
You take all the advice you can get.
You take all the advice you can get because you don't know. And I've talked to a lot of 18-year-olds being a college professor, and nobody knows what they want to do. And I said, I know exactly how you feel. I was there. And so when I pursued speech language pathology, I went to the State University of New York at Fredonia, and that is a SUNY college, also in Western New York, close to the PA border. And in Fredonia, it is actually situated in a rural area with lots of vineyards. And I was minoring in Spanish at the time. And I started to work in the schools around that area. I started to do clinical work and start observing speech language pathologists and working with children in the schools. And I noticed there were lots of Spanish speaking kids in the schools. And I noticed there were a lot of Spanish speaking families. And growing up, I mean, I grew up in a predominantly white community. Everybody was Roman Catholic. Everybody spoke English.
Homogenous.
Very homogenous. I didn't go to school with black children until I was in high school. I didn't have friends who were Latinx until I was in high school. Like I'd never even been on an airplane until I was a senior in high school.
Wow.
I lived in a bubble, my entire childhood. And so to go into a school and see all of these Spanish-speaking children in Western New York, in the countryside.
Almost like a culture shock.
It was completely a surprise. Because at that time, this was the late 90s. At that time, we still didn't have this huge influx of Spanish speakers all over the U.S. Yes, there were lots of Spanish speakers in border cities like in Texas and California, but not yet in Western New York, right? And in lots of parts of the Midwest. And so I got really interested in the Latinx community and in families working in agriculture in the rural areas of New York. And so I started using my Spanish that I had developed being a Spanish minor and working with Spanish-speaking kids. And my clinical supervisors started kind of keying in on that and saying, hey, can you help me with this kid? Can you help me with this kid? Because nobody else spoke Spanish. I did have one classmate who's Puerto Rican who also spoke Spanish, and she was in very high demand in my graduate program. But we were the only two who spoke Spanish in this community that was just full of Spanish-speaking kids. So that's really where I got my start in working with the Latinx community and in the field of speech-language pathology. And that's really where I fell in love with that community and really kind of was called to serve in that way with those kids, with bilingual kids.
I see. So then take me forward in your academic career. How did you end up in Temple?
So when you finish your bachelor's degree in speech language pathology, you have to do a master's in order to become a speech language pathologist. You have to do a 2-year master's degree. And so I stayed at SUNY Fredonia and did my 2-year master's degree. And then I followed a boyfriend to Syracuse, New York, as you do when you're 21 or 22 years old, right? And I worked in Syracuse, New York, and I did what's called your clinical fellowship year. And that's a year after your master's degree where you are supervised by a licensed speech language pathologist, but you're essentially working on your own. And I did early intervention work where it was home-based, where I went from home to home and worked with children, lots and lots of children in different minoritized communities. I worked in the Black community, I worked in the Latinx community, I worked with poor white children, but I typically worked in low socioeconomic communities in Syracuse, New York. And I worked also in skilled nursing facilities. I worked with older adults, and I also worked with bilingual older adults in skilled nursing facilities as well. And by the end of that clinical fellowship year, I'd broken up with the boyfriend, and I had realized I really didn't know what I was doing. I could speak Spanish, but I didn't really know what the right way to deliver services were to Spanish-speaking kids. I was trained on an English model, and I thought, well, should I just be superimposing this English model in Spanish, or are there other ways I should be doing this? So about 3 months into my clinical fellowship year, I thought, I have all these questions. Why don't I just answer them myself? I'm going to apply to PhD programs. Well, I'm glad I didn't know what I didn't know, because I didn't know you had to have research experience. I didn't know you had to, have these letters of recommendation from these big labs and people who are well funded. I didn't know any of this stuff, right? And so I just applied. I called my professor from Sueño Fredonia, who I loved, Dr. Perez, Dr. Dennis Perez, may he rest in peace. He was a wonderful mentor to me. And he gave me some tips, and he told me who to get my letters from, and I applied to all of these PhD programs, and I started getting rejection after rejection after rejection after rejection. And I said, why am I getting all these rejections? And I got on the phone with a professor at San Diego State, and she said, you're never going to get into any of these PhD programs because you have no research experience. And I said, oh man, okay. But then finally, the last letter and my number one choice.
Poetic.
Number one choice for PhD programs was from Temple University, from Brian Goldstein at Temple University, who accepted me into their PhD program, and who is, to this day, I was just texting with him yesterday, to this day is my mentor and guided me to become a phonologist who specializes in bilingual children. And so that's how I ended up at Temple, was really just a shot in the dark. And I always say, Brian, I was your diamond in the rough. And he says, well, you didn't have any bad habits, so I could just start from the ground up with you and kind of train you. So, I was kind of demoralized a little bit, but I got my foot in the door, and even though I didn't have the same skills as maybe a lot of first-year PhD students do,
you didn't have the same bias that they did.
Right. I mean, I just started. I just said, okay, I don't know anything, so I'm just going to start. And so that's how I started at Temple. And Temple led me to spend 6 months in Querétaro, Mexico, recording Spanish-speaking children. I teamed up with a traveling library, and we had a big van that had children's books, and we traveled from community to community. And I had a couple cultural brokers with me who were psychology professors, and they would talk to people in the community and say, hey, this is a student from the US who's doing research. Can she record your children? And I would go with the library and record children telling stories and get data from my dissertation. And it was just an absolutely incredible experience. I recorded kids on farms and churches and houses and out on the street. Like, it was just an incredible experience.
I was going to say, that sounds like something that would make like the highlight reel of your life.
Oh, absolutely. Like,
core memory.
I still clean my house with Fabulosa just so I can trigger those memories of being in Querétaro, honestly. Like, it is one of the most important experiences I've ever had, because not only have I learned some of what the Latinx experience is on this side of the border, but I got a window into what that experience is on the other side of the border. And I got to see what are some of the motivators for migrating to the U.S. and what are some of the reasons people need to come to the U.S., as well as, what is their experience when they get here. And so that was really important to me as an activist, to understand what is happening on both sides of the border. And I know I can't understand everything fully, but it certainly did give me some insight.
So after your PhD, I do have down on your file that you spent 12 years in Arizona.
I did. So after my PhD, I went out to San Diego first, and I did a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California, San Diego, and San Diego State. They have a dual program, and so I worked between both programs. I studied with Dr. Jessica Barlow, who's a theoretical phonologist, and I worked with her for 2 years and diversified my methodology, learned a little bit more about linguistics to apply to my research. And after that, I took a faculty position back east at SUNY New Paltz. I worked there for 2 years. And then I took a position at the University of Arizona, which is on the U.S.-Mexico border, which is just about 80 miles north of the U.S.-Mexico border in Tucson. And I spent 12 years there in that bilingual community. And that was incredible. It was incredible. I got to live right, in a community that had historically been an immigrant community, so there were folks in that community who had been there since before it was the United States. I got to live right on the border of the Tohono O'odham indigenous community nation and the Pasquayaki tribe. I had the opportunity to work in a preschool that was all Mexican and Mexican American children, and also there were white and black children in that community who all used a Spanish influenced variety of English because they went to school with Spanish speaking kids. The teachers, used Spanish influenced varieties of English. It was just such a rich linguistic community. It was just such a gift to be able to study language acquisition in that context.
So now moving forward, one thing that you did touch on when we started this conversation was intergenerational trauma in your family. Now, it has been brought to my attention that you do have children of your own. How is it like seeing the effects of your parents imbuing properties into you and now you raising the next generation? What's the difference?
Well, they say trauma runs in families until it runs into somebody who's willing to feel it. And I think that it ran into me, and I was willing to feel it and process it and protect my children from it. And that's not an easy thing to do for the person in the family who decides it stops with me.
There's no blueprint for it.
There's no blueprint for it. It's very hard to be the person who holds up the mirror. It's very hard to be the person who says the quiet part out loud. It's very hard to be the person who doesn't just maintain the status quo. It's difficult to be that person that, because nobody wants to really hear the truth. Everybody wants to just maintain. And so that's a hard path to walk, and it's a lonely one too. So, but that path that I walked provided my children with I don't want to say trauma-free childhood, because you can't protect your children from trauma. You can only really teach them how to process it. But it protected them from that kind of trauma. And I'll be forever grateful to myself that I had the capacity to protect them from that. Even though that's taken a toll on my life, I'm so happy to see that they are thriving and that will never be part of their story. So, and I think a lot of people in my generation are doing this now. I think a lot of us are realizing what happened to us as children. I'm certainly not the only one. I think a lot of us are saying, we know what happened. We're not accepting it. When we don't accept it for our children. And I think that that's just such a liberating thing for all of us. And so it's good. And so I see that a lot. I see it happening. The immigrant experience and intergenerational trauma, I see it in my students. I know I can see it when it's happening in the lives of my students. I recognize it. And so I have an understanding, even I know I'm a white woman and I don't understand everything that my students of color go through. I mean, I'm the first to admit that I make plenty of mistakes and have plenty of blind spots. And there are things about my childhood and about my lived experience that are touch points that I can connect with students in a way that maybe at face value you wouldn't look at me and know that I've had those experiies.
I was gonna say empathy is a strong starting point.
Yeah, it is, and it's incredible when you I was just telling one of my daughters the other day that when you experience something difficult in your life, one of the good things that comes out of that is that you can connect with someone else who also has had that experience. and make them feel less alone. And sometimes the only person that can make you feel better when you're going through a difficult experience is somebody who's also gone through that experience.
The trauma bonds
The
go
trauma,
deep.
yeah, and it might not be somebody you're friends with. It might not be somebody your family. It may not even be somebody you know very well.
It's happened to people on the bus.
Yeah, but just somebody who says, "I get it."
I think it's
right?
very human.
Yes, and that can be like transformative for people. So, I'm grateful I'm able to connect with people in that way.
So moving on from specifically family dynamics, you were raised in a homogenous area of
Very.
Buffalo, New York,
Yes.
while your children have spent some time in Arizona near the border.
Yes.
What difference does that make in their
Oh
development?
my gosh, so many differences. So my children went to a school where Tucson actually had to have a desegregation initiative because there were so many Latinx children in the schools in certain parts of the city, and they needed white children to come in and desegregate the schools. My children were part of that desegregation. So my children went to a predominantly Latinx school called Carrillo Elementary School, and they, they were the minority in the school, and I adored it because they would pronounce all the Spanish words with the correct Spanish pronunciation. They took part in Las Posadas, which is a Christmas celebration in the Mexican community in Tucson. They took part in that. They did baile folklorico, which is a Mexican style dance. They did that. They were so much a part of the cultural fabric of the Mexican community in Tucson when they were children, that the food they ate, the traditions, like my daughter's turning 13 on Sunday and she says, I want a tres leches cake for my birthday. Like
the best cake.
That's the birthday
Your
cake.
daughter knows what they're talking about.
That's the birthday cake she wants, right? Because that's what she grew up on. And so my children are just so much more multicultural than I was as a child. And they just have an outlook that's so different. They've had, one of my daughters has had a best friend who's Black, and the other one of my daughters has had best friends of all different backgrounds. And I love to see that so much for them, because we get to have so many conversations about things. Like just, one of my daughters and her friend who's Black were going into CVS one day, and they were talking about, she said, oh, this lady at CVS kicked us out because she said we were hanging around too long. And I said, well, the difference between you being in CVS and Charlie being in CVS, and the difference, with people watching Charlie versus you, and if you do something that could get Charlie in trouble, she's going to get in more trouble than you. And we have these really important conversations just about day-to-day things because they have diverse friends. And so it really makes it personal to them. It's not like they're talking about something over there. They're talking about their friends. And I think that the messages get absorbed better that way. And so I always tell them, you have a big responsibility because you're white children. You need to know this stuff. You need to learn about this stuff because you have a lot of power, and that power can be used for evil. And you need to know how to use your power for good. And you need to know how to cede power. And you need to know how to move in spaces where you are cognizant of racism. And so I'm so thrilled that my children are actually racially literate. And I was not as a child. I had to learn that as an adult.
I think it's great to see that you instill pride in your children that way. A lot of people, they take it the wrong way. A lot of people, when they can't absorb diversity and cultural enrichment going on around them, they remove themselves from it.
Yeah.
But instead, you instill in your children that they have a role to play in making sure that everything keeps rolling along. And I think that's great.
Yeah. Yeah, they have to lean into it. And something happened in school where a couple times there was a police officer parked outside of their school. They're in Mount Lebanon schools. And there's a police officer parked outside of school. I saw this happen a couple times, and I said to the kids, I said, why is there a police officer in schools? And one of my daughters said, oh, they're always walking around. They're always walking around. And I said, huh. And so I wrote an email to the principal. I said, why are there cops in the schools? Like, whatever. And she said, oh, it's part of this community program. They come in and teach the kids about this and this and this. And I said, but does it have to be cops that teach about that? Couldn't it be somebody else that comes in and teach about cyber? Can't the IT guy talk about cybersecurity? Why does it have to be a cop that talks about cybersecurity, right? And so, I talked to my daughters about that. I said, not every kid feels safe with the cops around, right?
The best way to improve community relations is to just do better in your community rather than try and force it.
Right?
But
Cops don't make everybody feel safe. And so the next time the cops rolled around, which they did, they came back to teach about cybersecurity or something. My daughter picked up on it right away. Mm-hmm. She's like, Mom, the police are here to talk about cybersecurity, But now they know, they don't just take it as, well, yeah, that's what the cops do. They have a critical eye towards, but why? Right?
I need to teach my children to spot the grift.
Yeah.
That's great.
It's like, but why? Like, I'm teaching them to question. Like, is that necessary?
Mm-hmm.
So, trying anyway.
Now, last thing I want to touch on, this wasn't originally on my list of things to talk about when we first came up with this episode, but with the things that are, currently going on in the nation with ICE coming into schools, coming into communities, tearing people out. Have you educated your children on what they need to do in those situations?
Absolutely. So I'm really proud. One of my daughters is actually doing a whole project on immigrants' rights right now. And if she wins, the school will make a donation to an immigrants' rights organization. And so she's been researching it all on her own. I haven't even given her any direction. She's been telling me what she's been finding out through her research, which is really great. But we have talked extensively about ICE. We've actually talked about what would happen, what we might do for students on this campus if ICE shows up, and how we would let students know they could come stay at our house if they needed a place to be, if they needed to get away from their address of record, that they could come to our house and stay with us, that, if we ever saw ICE on our street, that we would confront them, that you distract them, that you just get talking to them about whatever, you use up their time, right? Just use up their time. That you tell them, there's nobody here for you. You don't need to be here. Get out of here. That it really is the responsibility of the people who do have citizenship, who are white, to go out there and put your body between you and the people who are vulnerable. Like, literally put your body between you and the people who are vulnerable. And so I am definitely training them to get up out of your house and confront. And I say, make sure you have shoes you can run in. Always have shoes on you can run in. But we are watchful of our neighborhood. And like, if we see ICE in our neighborhood, we're pulling over and we're getting out, all three of my kids and me, and we're going to distract and use up their time. So they're very, very aware that ICE is they're terrorizing communities all over. When I heard that they were in Beachview, I was very, very upset, because that's a community where I have been recruiting partnerships for research, because I work with bilingual preschoolers. And so the idea that ICE could be hunting the families and the children I work with makes me physically ill. And for that to be happening in my own research community is upsetting. However, I lived in Arizona, and when we had racial profiling laws and we had a lot of this anti-immigrant sentiment on the border, my children have been protesting from the time that they were very small, because there was DACA pushback, there was Immigrants coming from Central American countries en masse, children, unaccompanied children coming over the border. This has been happening for the past 10, 15 years in Arizona on the border. So we've been protesting for years and years and years against ICE. And so we're kind of used to this in some ways, but it's sad that it's now here in this part of the country too. It's not just on the border anymore, it's here too.
Well, it's good to know that people are doing their part. Now, before we move on to this week's Artist Spotlight, the question that we ask every single person that comes onto the show: what is the best possible life advice that you can pass on to the people watching and listening?
Live authentically. Just be yourself. Be yourself in every space. It will make you the right friends and the right enemies. So don't worry about somebody not liking you, because if you're acting authentically, the right people won't like you.
Amen. That's a bar.
Yep.
Now, moving on to this week's Artist Spotlight, we'll be playing the song On My Back by Hollow North. I hope y'all enjoy.
To love, you told me that my best was not enough. Through the week I sat and thought about where my life was drifting. I was so shocked.
Hope y'all enjoyed On My Back by Hollow North, this week's Haven Artist Spotlight. You'll be able to catch them this weekend playing live at Haven. We will put their artist link in the description so that you can find their music. And of course, as always, we'll have the link to get tickets at Haven PGH so you can see them live this weekend. Again, Hollow North, On My Back. Now, getting into this week's second half topic, we're going to talk about the advancement of minorities in academia. I leave the floor open to you, Dr. Fabiano.
Well, I think that, academic spaces were spaces that were originated by white men who were slavers originally. These were institutions where women and people of color were never meant to be in. And so the fact that we are in these spaces is changing the face of everything. Just the existence of us in these spaces is resistance. And I was telling my research lab the other day that's made up of women and minorities or minoritized folks. I said, I know everybody's worried about what's happening right now. I said, but people have come before us and fought so that we can all be in this research space. And if their fighting meant something, or else we wouldn't all be here right now, sitting in this research space, because none of us were meant to be here. None of us should be here. This space was not created for us. And I often think about this as scholars being on the tenure track too, when we think about Black and brown professors on the tenure track and women on the tenure track, and the myth of academia saying, yes, this is for you, come on in, we want to diversify. But it's really made for white men who have wives. It's made for white men who have wives to raise their children. White men actually get a bump in terms of popularity when they have children. White men, by and large, when COVID happened, got more time to work on their papers and their grants. Women and people of color were drowning during that time because not only were they caregiving, but they were also taking care of, they were financially harmed, they were taking care of parents and neighbors and children and everybody under the sun. And, women and minoritized scholars often do research on their own communities, right? And that is sometimes harder to get funded than some of these other topics that maybe white men may research that are more in aligned with what, the people who decide to give out money want to fund, right? So there are all these inequities that push women and minoritized scholars out of the tenure track system. When they say, oh, this is for you, it's not really for us. So when we're going through it, when we struggle, we blame ourselves for struggling. And I think about this with students too, undergrad students or graduate students who are of color or women, that when they're struggling, they blame themselves. And so what I want to say to those students is there are invisible barriers put into place to trip you up in this system because the system was not created for you. If you know what those invisible barriers are going in, when you trip on them, then you won't blame yourself. Mm-hmm. You'll just say, oh, I know that's there because this system wasn't made for me. I'm going to walk around that and I'm going to keep going, right? But if you don't know it's there, then you just say, oh, I'm so clumsy. What's wrong with me? Maybe I don't belong here, right? I'm not like them. I have students who, they're sitting in class with all these white students who come from wealthy backgrounds, who went to schools that were well funded, whose parents are putting $500 in their checking accounts every week, while this Latinx student is sending money home to their parents from their part-time job, right? They're sharing their income, what little income they make, with their extended family. And I don't think a lot of faculty are aware of that. I don't think that even crosses the minds of a lot of faculty members. I know when I've brought that up in meetings, people look shocked. So what I want students to be aware of is keep coming to these spaces, because you change them just by being who you are, just by walking in the door, just by setting foot in the classroom, just by giving a presentation or writing a paper or sharing a perspective. You're shifting what this space was intended to be, and you're making it something different. You're creating it as something different, something bigger, something deeper, something more representative of who we are. And, you're expanding our ways of knowing, our epistemologies, right? That there's more than one way of knowing. There isn't just a white way of knowing or a white male way of knowing. There's lots of ways of knowing. And when you move through these spaces, you're sharing your way of knowing. And that benefits everybody.
It's like pollination.
It is. It is. So that's my first point of advice, is know your invisible barriers. And that leads me to my second, which is have good mentorship. Because good mentors will tell you what those invisible barriers are. So as soon as you can in your academic career, find a mentor or mentors who you really connect with. That may be one of your professors, that may be, maybe an older graduate student that you connect with, maybe a graduate student who's a TA for your course, but someone in your academic spaces who's ahead of you, who can guide you on your path, who's already walked that path and can tell you what to expect on that path. And maybe that somebody is going to be the same race or ethnicity as you, maybe that somebody isn't. But that person has to be able to acknowledge that your experience is going to be a different one than white students are, for example, or male students, right? They've got to be able to talk about race. They've got to be able to talk about racism, sexism. They have to be able to say the words and acknowledge it, right? And they have to know that that's truth. They have to acknowledge that what you're telling them is truth. And they can help you navigate, saying, okay, this is going to come up. This is how you navigate it. This is going to come up. This is how you navigate it, right? So mentorship is key. And then expand your mentorship network. And you may go outside of your department to find networks, mentorship networks. You may even go outside of your your university to find mentorship networks, but every time you feel a connection and trust with a mentor, add them to your mentorship network. Because different mentors will give you different bits of information that are going to be helpful to you. And I know this because I have a mentorship network of my own. And I have people I go to when I think, I don't know how to do this situation. I don't know how to make this decision. I don't know what the right thing is. Or I did this. I don't know if it was right. I need to talk to this person. I need to bounce ideas off of this person. Or I'm applying to this job I've never done before. Let me talk to this person who's done it, right? So you need mentors in your life your entire career, but especially if you're a student of color and if you're a woman, you need mentors in your career. So, and I would say first generation students more broadly too, really need that. So that's my second point. And I think my third point has more to do with kind of the system of the university in and of itself is finances, right? And there's a correlation between being first gen and being of color and being low SES. And so I think it's really a financial struggle for students to be in college when you don't come from wealth. And I know that there are lots of scholarships out there and whatnot, but there's sometimes low-hanging fruit to get funding for things. Talk to your mentors about scholarships and funding in the department and funding at the school level. Ask them about some of these things, because sometimes, for example, like for us, the American Speech, Language, and Hearing Association has scholarships available every year, and a lot of them are earmarked for students of color. So if you need help figuring out how to apply for them, it's no problem. I can help you, or I can get my grad student to help you, or I can get a student who's applied for them already to help you. But seek out money when you can to help support you through the process. The other thing I would say is look for work opportunities within your department in research labs before you go out and try to find a job at Starbucks or, Jimmy John's or something like that. Because research shows that students who work on college campuses in the departments do better academically than the students who are working outside the campus at some other job. Because when you're working in a research lab, you're getting academic experience while you're getting paid. So before you go and look for a part-time job someplace else, look within your department and see if any of the researchers have a lab where you could apply for a paid hourly student worker position. And then you can put that on your resume, and you have, not only are you getting a paycheck, but you're also getting research experience too. So that would be my advice.
Now, as to that point specifically, let me ask you this. I understand, as someone who is a student worker myself, sometimes that the wages aren't all that they should be.
Yeah.
Where do you think the cutoff is in terms of the gap between, say, working at Raising Cane's or working in the office? Should I take that office job if Raising Cane's is going to pay me, let's say, $8 an hour more?
I mean, I pay my students between $15 and $20 an hour. If I can max them at $20 an hour, I do. So you would be surprised. I mean, anybody who's a PI or the head advisor on a research grant, it's up to them how much they pay you. So if I have people in my lab who I'm paying to do data analysis and stuff, undergrads, I can pay them whatever I want. So if I want to pay them $16 an hour, I can. So that's something that you might want to negotiate with your PI and say, hey, I would really love to work for you, but I have this opportunity over here that's going to pay me this much. Can you match that?
Usually that is leverage.
Yeah, because they have the ability to shift your pay. So ask.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Now, another question I have for you. In season 1, I interviewed Dr. Betty Wilson at the University of South Carolina. She is a black woman in academia. She talked about her experience of coming through the ranks and constantly being told that she had to be strong and independent, and how that sort of hardened her and dehumanized her because that's just not the person that she is. Coming through your tenured track, did you feel the same way? Did you feel like you had to be that strong woman, a strong woman example for other women potentially coming through the ranks?
I feel like the tenure track almost killed me. And I don't say that metaphorically, I say that literally. I started my tenure track position 6 weeks after I had a baby. And I started working immediately. My baby was 6 weeks old. I put her in daycare at 6 weeks old. I was not even fully recovered from having her. I gave up breastfeeding very quickly because I couldn't manage it with the job, the demands of the job. I felt like I had to prove myself. I don't know that I felt like I had the responsibility of being a model for other upcoming scholars the way a black woman would feel she needs to be a model, because there are so few black women in academia. The numbers are atrocious, like 2% or lower in some universities. So that is an incredible amount of pressure for black women to be the representation, right? To be the model for other black students and other black scholars coming up. I felt like I needed to prove that I was just as good as the men who were coming up alongside of me, that I was just as good as the women who didn't have children, that I was just as serious a scientist as everyone else was, and that I wasn't this kind of mommy who wasn't going to be serious scientist who couldn't get funded or wasn't going to publish, right? And so I just went like a speeding train into getting funded and getting publications. And yeah, I was raising my baby, and then I got pregnant with twins less than 2 years later. I had them early, I'm sure because of stress. I developed a condition called preeclampsia. They were born 7 weeks early. They were in the NICU. And while they call it kangaroo care, where you kind of hold them on your chest for like a lot of hours. So they're like still in the womb. I had my phone and I was answering student emails. I had them in the middle of the semester. I was answering student emails while I was kangaroo carrying them. And it was just like an out-of-body experience. It was awful.
And the stress it kept you going.
Yeah, it was almost like I needed to suffer to succeed. And I did. I got tenure. at the University of Arizona. But I made huge sacrifices to my mental health and my physical health, and I self-abandoned completely. I was not taking care of myself. I was completely taking care of my children and getting my publications and my grants. And if I can do anything for younger women coming up behind me, it's to do as I say, not as I do. And I do not believe women should have to do that to get tenure. And I don't believe you should have to be somebody different than who you are to succeed. And I know that there are systems that force people into these roles. And I know that Betty was forced to do what she had to do to survive. And it's wrong. And it's wrong what happened to me. And I won't allow, as long as I'm in these spaces, I won't allow that to happen to any woman that's around me.
As a man, I can say that there was definitely a salty man seeing you get tenure as a woman. I'm glad that you made it through. I understand personally, as a black person, I understand that as minorities, we have to exceed the expectations of those who are watching us. As a black man, I have to work 3 times harder to just get the single recognition. As a woman, you have to work harder to show that you're serious, that you're not supposed to be a secretary, that you're not supposed to be a receptionist, that you are academically, scientifically on the same level as a man. I
Right.
completely understand.
It's hard because, especially when you do pediatric research,
Working with
men will
kids.
look at you and be like, "Oh, oh, you're a kindergarten teacher," and it's difficult to sometimes be in these spaces and not be taken as seriously as men are in their research programs, and it's sometimes a lot of reasons why women just leave. And I think that was really laid bare during the pandemic, that women, the brunt of caregiving is still put squarely on women. And no matter, like, if you're a neuroscientist or a molecular biologist, or no matter if you're in the hard scientists or whatever you do, the caregiving is still put on you. And so even if you do the same kind of science as men, you're still behind the eight ball. And so it's hard. It's hard to look at men who are your contemporaries and see them gaining, like getting ahead of you, and saying to yourself, I know I started with them and they're 5 steps ahead of me because I had children and I slowed down, and they didn't have to slow down because they had wives who raised their children. And I had to slow down because I had to do it.
Now, let me ask you this. Coming up through your academic career, do you have any major regrets? Anything that you would do differently?
I think I would not self-sacrifice and self-abandon so much. I think I would love myself through it more. I think I would care for myself through it more. I think I would back myself up. I would talk to myself in a little kinder way. I think I would talk to myself the way that I talk to my students, and encourage myself the way I encourage my students. I think I felt like I needed to suffer to succeed, and I needed to shame myself into working harder. And that's not right. And I would do that differently.
Now, before we get out of here, is there anything else you want to get across to our audience?
I would say, even though I've said a lot of negative things and talked about how hard things are, research is so much fun. And the joy of research, I think everybody should have access to. And if I didn't love it so much, I would have left a long time ago, because none of they don't pay us enough to make this worth it. They don't. There's not a lot of money in this gig. They don't pay enough to make this worth it. You have to love research so much that you say, nobody's pushing me out of this, because this is the joy of my life. And the other thing I want to say, our students are the best part of the job. If I didn't have my students, it wouldn't be worth it. I love my students. I love working with my students. I love mentoring my students. I love teaching my students. I don't think students realize how much happiness they bring to our lives, how much life they give us, how much energy they breathe into us, new ideas and excitement. And when they get excited about something that we're excited about, how that pushes us to think about new things, and how that re-energizes us. And maybe we get down, but a student comes in and says, hey, look at this, what I found. And it gives us, motivates us to keep going. I don't think students know that. And so I just want to say thank you to the students for that. You're the joy of my life.
I think that's a beautiful place to leave off. Again, this is the incredible Dr. Leah Fabiano. All things Dr. Fabiano will be in the description of the episode, so you can reach out to her if you'd like. This has been another amazing episode of Let's Talk Social Innovation. I'm your host, Ian Kahene, and we are signing off. Peace out, y'all.